Chapter 23, Woodrow Wilson and the Great War, which of course is referring to World War I. So in this chapter, we're going to look at Wilson's moral diplomacy and then World War I. So we'll start here with Wilson's moral diplomacy. So Wilson sort of set the moral tone for his foreign policy by first denouncing dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy is simply when we interfere in a foreign nation's economy. For instance, if we loaned China money and then forcibly interfered when they didn't pay us back, it would seem obnoxious. So he denounced this type of foreign policy. In some matters, this idealism provided a good basis for foreign policy, but where vital interests were concerned, Wilson shifted his, quote, morality toward America's interests. And it was really American interests took priority over Wilson's idealism, which seemed kind of contradictory. For instance, the importance of the Panama Canal made Wilson unwilling to tolerate unrest in the Caribbean, or willing to send troops over to make sure that there was not unrest in the Caribbean while we were building the Panama Canal. Wilson's most fervent missionary diplomacy, as our textbook calls it, really manifested itself in Mexico. And part of it was because of his personal hatred of the Mexican dictator, a guy named Victoriano Huerta. And this guy was a military general who had seized power from the previous president, Francisco Madero. And this eventually led to American military intervention in Mexico's internal affairs. Wilson demanded that Huerta hold free elections, or America would continue to mediate in their civil war. So Winfield Scott led an assault on Mexico City and forced Huerta to abdicate or give up his presidency or his throne, his dictatorship. And so the next guy took over, and this was a general named General Carranza. And he actually favored a representative government, but because he was an ineffective leader, he was overthrown by one of his generals, Pancho Villa. And Villa promised Wilson that he would cooperate with the United States. And so Wilson took him at his word and sent support. Well, it turned out that Pancho Villa was nothing more than a bandit, only concerned with personal power. And so trying to force Americans to get more involved, he went into our border, stopped a train in northern Mexico, and killed 16 Americans in cold blood, and then burned the town of Columbus, New Mexico. And so eventually Wilson was forced to pull out of Mexican affairs. So on a somewhat different topic, Europe explodes in war. So when World War I broke out in 1914, most Americans believed that the conflict did not concern them. And of course, this war broke out when a Serbian nationalist who was hoping to free Bosnians from the Austrian Empire assassinated the heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his lovely wife, while they were visiting Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia. And because of the existing entangling alliances in Europe, this quickly engrossed all of Europe into a war. And so the first thing Wilson did was he issued a proclamation of neutrality. The war, he believed that, and many people believed that the war was contrary to progressive ideals. And, combined with the traditional American fear of entanglement in European affairs, provided ample justification for neutrality. And, most Americans wanted to stay out of the war anyway, but nearly all of them were partial to either one side or the other. Those people of German or Austrian or Irish descent tended to sympathize with the Central Powers, but the majority, influenced by the ties of Anglo-American culture and successful Allied propaganda sided with the Allies. Okay, so freedom of the seas. So the United States was really smart economically here because they were already anticipating the economic benefits of trading with all belligerents of war. So the United States found that Britain's control of the Atlantic was really frustrating because they were, wanting to trade with everyone. And Britain was declaring almost all commodities to be contraband of war or illegally imported goods. So they would pull ships to port, they would search it for goods being taken to an enemy, and then a lot of times cargoes were confiscated without any payment. And so American firms that were trading with the Central Powers were blacklisted, and Great Britain wouldn't even deal with them. But although British tactics would exasperate Wilson, it didn't really result in innocent loss of life. So Wilson never seriously considered an embargo. Given British naval superiority and the economic importance of America, any action by the U.S. would have a negative impact on one side or the other. And so ultimately, increased trade with the Allies and profits from loans to France and England tied Americans more closely to the Allies, simply because we were having more business dealings with them. And in addition to that, Germany's use of submarine warfare brought new questions to issues of naval warfare and neutral rights. U-boats were extremely vulnerable on the surface, and they were too small to carry survivors, so they couldn't really operate by the old rules of war. And so the result was often a heavy loss of life. And one example of that is the sinking of the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, in May 1915, with the loss of 128 American lives. And this brought an outcry from the American public. And after dragging out the controversy for almost a year, Germany apologized and agreed to pay an indemnity. But a year later, the sinking of the Sussex produced another strong American protest, and this led Germans to promise in the Sussex Pledge that they would stop sinking merchant ships without warning. The election of 1916. So in this election, Woodrow Wilson was facing a unified Republican Party. If you think back to the election of 1912, the Republicans had been divided between Taft and Roosevelt. And so in order to boost his numbers, Wilson wanted to gain support from the progressives. So he did a couple of things to try to make that happen. The first thing was that he nominated a guy named Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. And this guy was a Jewish American progressive. He also signed the Farm Loan Act, which gave low-cost loans to farmers. He also approved the Keating-Owens Child Labor Act, which barred goods manufactured by children under 16. So if goods had been produced by kids under 16, they were barred in the United States. And he also agreed to a workman's comp package for federal employees and modified his stance on the tariff, approving a tariff commission. And in doing so, he really put into effect much of the Progressive Party platform of 1912. So Wilson's maintenance of American neutrality and his progressive domestic policies won him a narrow victory over Republican challenger Charles Evan Hughes. The road to war. So, in an effort to try to mediate this European war, President Wilson sent his advisor, Colonel Edward House, to try to negotiate with the belligerents. And this was basically an attempt to end the war by mediation. And House went to London and Paris and Berlin, and he found out very quickly that they were not ready to give up on this war. They did not want peace without victory. And so the Europeans pretty much refused to respond to Wilson's plea. And after that, a series of events led the United States closer to war. For one, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in February of 1917. And so they had issued the Sussex Pledge saying they wouldn't strike without warning. And so the Germans renounced the Sussex Pledge and said that they would target all ships headed for Allied ports. And we had lots of ships going to Allied ports. And they had 100 U-boats, and they were hoping to starve the British into submission. And really, the Germans wanted to finish off the Allies before the United States could get involved. Another thing that led to American intervention was the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram. And the Zimmermann telegram was released in March, after which Wilson authorized the arming of American merchantmen. And the Zimmermann note had been written by Germans and sent to, intercepted, but it was on the way to Mexico, trying to get Mexico to fight against us, and then agreeing to give Mexico some land in the United States if the Central Powers were successful. And so on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson requested that Congress declare war on Germany. And just 4 days later, the Senate voted 82-6, and the House voted 373-50 in favor of war. So mobilizing for war. So although America's entry into the war pretty much assured an Allied victory, the conversion of America's economy to a wartime focus proceeded really slowly. And honestly, the war ended before much of that process was complete. The Allies were running out of men, they were running out of supplies, and frankly, running out of hope when the United States joined. And if the Americans had not entered, it's likely that the peace terms would have been dictated at Berlin instead of Paris. So after Russia exited the war, the Germans were free to move their troops from Eastern Germany to Western Germany. And they had also sent over 1 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean with their U-boats. So even with all, it took a long time for the Americans to mobilize for war in spite of all that. Conscription didn't begin until 6 months after the declaration of war. It began, but the men didn't reach their training camps until about 6 months after the declaration of war. And Wilson finally created the War Industries Board to direct industrial mobilization. And the War Industries Board was pretty much given almost dictatorial power to allocate materials, standardize materials, fix the prices. Antitrust laws were suspended for a while, and producers were encouraged to cooperate with each other. America was actually really successful in mobilizing food supplies under the leadership of future President Herbert Hoover, who was a mining engineer and former head of the Belgian Relief Commission. And he was in charge of supervising agricultural production. And he set the price of wheat at $2.20 a bushel to encourage production. He purchased Cuban and American sugar and sent it to Great Britain to be refined. And most importantly, to avoid rationing, he came up with a different way to conserve food. And so he had wheatless Mondays, where no one ate wheat on Mondays, and meatless Tuesdays, where families didn't eat meat on Tuesdays. Boy Scouts planted vegetable gardens, and restaurants began to add horse meat and rabbit meat. But he found creative ways around having to ration food. And so wartime government planning and regulation began this new era in cooperation between government and business. And so we will end there, and we'll pick up tomorrow with workers in wartime and paying for the war.